are out of town. So I'll be picking up with Isaiah 47, which is last week the pastor covered the 46th chapter. So, well, I got to wait 53 seconds, so. So how's everyone doing? Wonderful. Oh, close the door back here. Okay. So as we begin chapter 47, I want us to briefly look back at chapter 46. And we're going to put the first verse of 46 on the screen in a minute. There we go. And it says, Bel and Nebo, the gods of Babylon, bow as they are lowered to the ground. They are being hauled away on ox carts. That's from the NLT translation. Bel was another name for Marduk, which was Babylon's chief deity, while Nebo was his son. These gods, it says, were hauled away in ox carts like trash, leaving the Babylonians to ask, well, who can now protect the people? So, are things any different from the way they were in Babylon today? Instead of worshiping idols made of wood and stone, have we tried to replace the only true God with things like artificial intelligence? What do I mean? Who do we go to for guidance? To God? Or to Amazon's Alexa? Apple's Siri? Or some other AI-powered virtual assistant? Although AI can be useful, we must be careful never to let it replace God in our life. So in the rest of chapter 46, God tells the stubborn people of Judah to listen to him because he's about to set things right. God's about to show Israel what happens to those who disobey him, which is a lesson that the Hebrew people desperately needed to learn. So now as we go to chapter 47, God says he will take vengeance on the people of Babylon. So we're going to read through the entire chapter and examine what happens. Beginning in verse 1. Come down and sit in the dust, O virgin daughter of Babylon. Sit on the ground without a throne, O daughter of the Chaldeans. For you shall no more be called tender and delicate. Take the millstones and grind flour. Put off your veil. Strip off your robe. Uncover your legs. Pass through the rivers. Your nakedness shall be uncovered, and your disgrace shall be seen. I will take vengeance, and I will spare no one. Our Redeemer, the Lord of hosts is his name, is the Holy One of Israel. Sit in silence and go into darkness, O daughter of the Chaldeans, for you shall no more be called the mistress of kingdoms. I was angry with my people. I profaned my heritage. I gave them into your hand. You showed them no mercy. On the aged You made your yoke exceedingly heavy. You said, I shall be mistress forever. So that you did not lay these things to heart or remember their end. Now, therefore, hear this, you lover of pleasures, who sit securely, who say in your heart, I am, and there is no one besides me. I shall not sit as a widow or know the loss of children. These two things shall come to you in a moment, in one day. The loss of children and widowhood shall come upon you in full measure, in spite of your many sorceries and the great power of your enchantments. You felt secure in your wickedness. You said, no one sees me. Your wisdom and your knowledge led you astray. And you said in your heart, I am, and there is no one besides me. But evil shall come upon you, which you will not know how to charm away. Disaster shall fall upon you, for which you will not be able to atone. And ruin shall come upon you suddenly, of which you know nothing. Stand fast in your enchantments and your many sorceries with which you have labored from your youth. Well, perhaps you may be able to succeed. Perhaps you may inspire terror. You are wearied with your many counsels. Let them stand forth and save you. Those who divide the heavens, who gaze at the stars, who at the new moons make known what shall come upon you. Behold, they are like stubble. The fire consumes them. They cannot deliver themselves from the power of the flame. No coal for warming oneself is this, no fire to sit before. Such to you are those with whom you have labored, who have done business with you from your youth. They wander about, each in his own direction. There is no one to save you. Now, unfortunately, that's all the slides that got copied. I had like 30 slides to show you. I have all my notes, but I don't have any of the remaining slides, so we'll have to improvise. So, verse 1 says, come down and sit in the dust, O virgin daughter of Babylon. Now, before we get into that, chapter 46 showed the Babylonian gods, Bel and Nebo, being hauled away, like I said, like trash, which indicates that the end is near for the Babylonian Empire. Now we get into verse 1 of chapter 47, and again it says, come down and sit in the dust, O virgin daughter of Babylon. So what does it mean by sit in the dust? Well, it's actually a figure of speech for being deeply humbled. The metaphor of a defeated city as a woman lying or sitting in the dust dates all the way back to as far as 2000 BC, to the laments over the destruction of the great cities of Ur, which was the birthplace of Abraham, and Sumer in southern Mesopotamia. The phrase sit on the ground without a throne means humiliation will include being deprived of its former glory of reigning and being king. Notice that Isaiah uses the terms Chaldean and Babylonian interchangeably. Biblical scholar F.F. Bruce said the word Chaldeans is practically synonymous with Babylonians in that the last and greatest dynasty to rule in Babylon was of Chaldean origin. So, what is meant by virgin daughter of Babylon? The ancient Near East had a convention of referring to cities as being female. The city of Babylon is pictured as the daughter of a nation in the same way that Jerusalem is often pictured as a daughter of Zion. Virgin daughter of Babylon is meant as a title of respect, drawing on the image of a virgin as someone who is beautiful, desirable, and unconquered. No one had yet breached her wall. The last part of this verse says, "For you shall no more be called tender and delicate." The city and the empire are both depicted as tender and delicate, a young woman of fastidious and luxurious tastes who has never had to face the harsh side of life. Now that's all ending, and no one will ever describe her in those terms again. She has lost her authority and her protected lifestyle. So we move on to verse 2, which says, take your heavy millstones, or the millstones and grind flour, put off your veil, strip off your robe, uncover your legs, pass through the rivers. So, what in the world does this have to do with Babylon? Remember, verse 1 personified the city as a woman. Here, the woman who was once royalty is given the lowliest of chores of a slave girl. Work at the millstones was considered the lowest form of slavery. Grinding grain with millstones, literally hand mill, was one of the most arduous tasks performed by slave girls. Therefore, the image of using millstones to grind flour means she must assume the life of hard work of an ordinary woman. So she went from being royalty to being relegated to doing that which a slave girl would do. As a slave, the woman could no longer wear the veil and long gown, characteristic of an upper-class woman. And many commentaries believe the phrase, "uncover your legs," refers to gathering up her skirts as she set off to work in the fields or to work in the irrigation ditches. However, the context, I think, indicates that removing a woman's veil and uncovering her legs refer to the exposure of a proud woman's body and therefore to her humiliation. This is made clear, actually, in the next verse, in verse 3, which says that nakedness shall be uncovered and your disgrace shall be seen. Babylon now learns what it's like to serve others. She has to live like all the other defeated lands. She's lost her independence. Verse 3 says, your nakedness shall be uncovered and your disgrace shall be seen. I will take vengeance and I will spare no one. As I stated before, Babylon has been utterly humiliated. Her nakedness is a figure of speech for being defenseless. The same type of language is used elsewhere in the book of Isaiah to describe being taken into exile. One of the slides I previously had, but it's not here, is on Isaiah 20, verse 4, so I'm just going to read it to you. It says, so shall the king of Assyria lead away the Egyptian captives and the Cushite exiles, both the young and the old, naked and barefoot, with buttocks uncovered, the nakedness of Egypt. So here in Isaiah 47, the text says, I will take vengeance and I will spare no one. In today's vernacular, vengeance typically means revenge, usually in response to anger. In a court of law today, there are two judgments that can typically be rendered. Compensatory, which is designed to reimburse the plaintiff for actual losses, and punitive, which is designed to punish the defendant. The Hebrew concept of vengeance is more like compensatory damages and relates to seeking justice for the person who has committed the wrongdoing. Similarly, God will judge Babylon with the right proportion of retribution based on the nature of her sins. God's not punitive in nature. Babylon has been mistreating others for a long time, but the time is coming when she will experience what she has meted out to others. We know that the Lord did indeed take vengeance on Babylon and spared no one. This was made evident by Cyrus, the king of Persia, who took Babylon effortlessly, and by morning, every citizen of the empire was not a Babylonian anymore, but a Persian. And for those of you who are Star Wars fans, in this case, the empire never strikes back. We move on to verse 4. It says, "Our Redeemer, the Lord of hosts is his name, the Holy One of Israel." This verse reveals that God is the one who has been speaking. Isaiah started calling Yahweh the Holy One of Israel way back at the very beginning of the book in chapter 1, verse 4. Usually in situations where he either judges or frees Israel. Additionally, Isaiah frequently links this title for God with some form of the Hebrew words translated as your Redeemer. In these passages, God judges Israel's opponents, thus acting as Israel's kinsman redeemer, the one freeing them from servitude. And here in chapter 47, Yahweh also acts as Israel's redeemer, again, freeing them from the servitude to the Babylonians. So now we move on to verse 5. And it says, "Sit in silence and go into darkness, O daughter of the Chaldeans." So we remember in verse 1, Babylon was told to sit in the dust and sit on the ground. Here, she's told to sit in silence and go into darkness. It's possible that being silent may mean that in her humiliated state, Babylon was no longer or will no longer brag about her accomplishments and will no longer tell others what to do. Going into darkness could refer to a dark time in Babylon's history dominated by captivity or bondage, deprivation, and grief, a far cry from the days of her glory when she held the destiny of other nations in the palm of her hands. So the text then says, "For you shall no more be called the mistress of kingdoms." Now that's from the ESV. The New American Standard says, "You will no longer be called the queen of kingdoms instead of the mistress of kingdoms." Now, instead of the mistress of kingdoms, up until this point, Babylon had enjoyed a position similar to that of a female head of household and queen mother. That is, she was the power behind the throne. She was protected and she had power over others. Because of Babylon's history as an ancient city and the Assyrians' high regard for Babylon's strategic importance, they actually spared the city during previous incursions. For example, rather than destroy Babylon, mighty Tiglath-Pileser III chose to proclaim himself king of Babylon back in 729 BC. And Sargon V did the same thing in 709 BC. Even after Sennacherib destroyed Babylon in 689 BC, the Assyrians actually rebuilt Babylon. It seemed as though no one could take her out permanently. She was invincible. However, her time to shine was over. God was about to judge her. So we move on to verse 6. Verse 6 provides the reason Babylon seemed so invincible and was able to destroy the very temple of God and carry God's chosen people into captivity. God says, I was angry with my people. I don't know about you, but I don't want God to ever say that about me. God was angry with the Hebrew people because of their sin. Therefore, God says, I profaned my heritage. So, what do you think that means? I profaned my heritage. Scripture tells us that God chose the people of Israel as his heritage. God gave the Hebrew people his laws to pass down from generation to generation, which developed into their traditions, beliefs, and culture. And thus the people were God's heritage. Therefore, when he says, I profaned my heritage, it means that God let foreigners invade Judah and capture his chosen people. Verse 6 then says, I gave them into your hand. You showed them no mercy. On the aged, you made your yoke exceedingly heavy. Had God not given the Hebrews to them, the Babylonians would never have been able to touch God's chosen people. However, because the Babylonians showed no mercy to the Jews and even treated the elderly harshly, they would now receive God's judgment. Rather than showing mercy, the Babylonians were arrogant, believing they could do whatever in the world they wanted and that they were masters of their own fate. And as we go to verse 7, we see that where their arrogance led them to say, I shall be mistress, or as the New American Standard says, queen mother, forever. Well, why did they believe this? Well, like the Assyrian Empire before them, Babylon may have prided herself on having captured many, many nations, including Judah. She defeated Assyria, which had been dominant force throughout the Middle East for 300 years. Therefore, the Babylonians considered themselves the greatest superpower on planet Earth. Totally invincible. Additionally, the Babylonian kings considered themselves to actually be gods. So they had no concept of there being just one God who created the entire universe. Therefore, they did not realize their conquests were actually part of God's plan. The final statement in verse 7, you did not lay these things to heart or remember their end, tells us that because Babylon believed that she would rule the world forever, she did not consider that she might have to be held accountable for the way she treated her captive peoples. Nevertheless, the Babylonians treated these captive peoples however she wanted. The Babylonians failed to take the time to reflect on their actions or even consider their consequences. Even today, some nations believe it's completely acceptable to commit inhumane actions with impunity, even if these same actions would be considered criminal if done by a private individual outside of wartime. Individuals as well as nations must learn that our actions have consequences. I'm going to read a verse from the book of James, which is not on the slides. It says, "Know this, my beloved brothers, let every person be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger, for the anger of man does not produce the righteousness of God." We must learn to slow down, think about what we're planning to say or do, and pray about it first before acting out. If the Babylonians had learned that lesson, things might have gone very differently for them. Okay, now we'll move into verse 8. The prophet Isaiah now contrasts Babylon's arrogant self-confidence with the sudden and complete humiliation that's going to come upon her. In verse 8, he calls Babylon a lover of pleasures. Being a lover of pleasures is a title that frequently fits those in positions of wealth and power, even today. He then says that she sits securely, thinking none would dare attack her. The prophet then states that Babylon says the following to herself: "I am, and there is no one besides me." Now, I want to address briefly the translation adopted by the ESV, the New American Standard, the NIV, and the New King James. They translate the text, "I am, and there is no one besides me." To me, this translation makes it sound very similar to Exodus 3:14, where God told Moses, "Say this to the people of Israel, I am, has sent me to you." In that text, the Hebrew for "I am" is actually Yahweh, the name of God. And I think Babylon may be repeating what God said in Isaiah chapter 45, which is, "I am the Lord," or "I am the I am, and there is no other. Besides me, there is no God." Babylon actually said to herself, "I am the supreme God who controls everything. All the gods, including Israel's God, do my bidding." Talk about arrogance and pride. Her self-satisfaction spills over into blasphemy. So verse 8 concludes with Babylon saying, "I shall not sit as a widow or know the loss of children." So what does that mean? Again, it's a figure of speech. That means Babylon falsely believed that her people and her vassal states will never be taken away from her by a stronger military power. Babylon actually depended on the taxation of her vassal states to fund her lavish lifestyle. Just like back in those days, an older woman would depend on her children to provide for her when she could no longer work. A vassal state is a nation that is subordinate to a more powerful country, often obligated to pay tribute, provide military support, or adhere to the dominant power's foreign policy while retaining some internal autonomy. So Babylon could not flourish without income from her subjugated peoples. Thus, the prophet Isaiah uses a figure of speech here to state that Babylon said to herself that the city will continue to flourish indefinitely, never going to lose her subjugated peoples, never going to become a widow. However, verse 9 paints a very different picture. Two things will happen to Babylon in just one day, it says. She will lose her children and become a widow. One commentary wrote, "It's fair to conclude that the city's husband may be her king, her leaders, or her soldiers. All would have a part in her secure position. It's also fair to conclude that her children are her citizens, her sister cities, and her armies. All these are products of the mother city, the capital, Babylon. To have her citizens' taxes sent elsewhere and her vassals' payment, often in the form of resources, money, or military services, contribute to the wealth of another king, meant that Babylon would be doomed. When the armies of Cyrus entered Babylon, overnight her citizens became subjects of Persia, and her wealth was at the disposal of her conquerors." So verse 9 concludes with Isaiah saying that these things will happen in spite of your many sorceries and the great power of your enchantments. The Babylonians were actually known throughout the world for developing the magical arts. In fact, the term Chaldean, back in the book of Daniel, actually means magician. However, even Babylon's many sorcerers, with their great power, will not be able to stop her downward spiral. So we move on to verse 10. Verse 10. Thank you. Verse 10 says, "Babylon felt secure in her wickedness." What constituted her evil deeds? Well, Babylon was filled with pride. She showed no mercy to the Hebrews, including oppressing the elderly. She developed and trusted in sorcery and magic, and considered herself to be God. She also possessed military power greater than any other nation, and thus she felt secure in doing whatever evil she so desired. Babylon's wisdom and knowledge, some of which came from superior scientific knowledge, and some from her knowledge of the magical arts and those who practiced it, actually deceived her into thinking she could act with impunity, or in other words, without fear of consequences, as if she was the only God that mattered and nobody could see her or hold her accountable. So do we ever think the same way today? Do we believe that we should be able to do whatever we want without consequences? Babylon was blind to the existence of Yahweh, who alone is God, and will bring Babylon to judgment. So has anything changed from then until now? Do people still say there is no God and no afterlife? Do people still look to science, the internet, AI, worldly wisdom, and even fortune tellers for all the answers to life's problems? Verse 11 describes how God will punish Babylon for their evil behavior. The prophet says that evil and disaster will fall upon Babylon, and that all her magic and sorcery will prove powerless to stop it. God, as always, will judge justly. The punishment will always fit the crime. The disaster and ruin will be such that even Babylon will lack the resources to pay a sufficient price, a sufficient ransom price to make atonement. Unexpectedly and without any warning, the city, which had confidently and presumptuously predicted that she would not know any loss, will experience destruction on an unprecedented scale. The sudden ruin that will come is incomprehensible to Babylon at this point. Just as she does not know how to charm away her troubles, she does not know what is coming and how terrible it's going to be. Although Babylon had an abundance of knowledge, she will not know how to deal with the judgment that God's bringing her way or how to appease God's anger. They didn't even recognize the existence and power of Yahweh. Thus, the Babylonians will not be able to atone for their sins. This demonstrates that their religious philosophies of magic and sacrificing are not capable of bringing true forgiveness of sin. They cannot buy off God with just another offering or sacrifice. God demands a complete confession of sin and true repentance before atonement can be granted. The New American Standard translates the last phrase in verse 11 as, "And destruction about which you do not know will come upon you suddenly." I find it interesting, I wish I had the slide for this, but the Hebrew word here for destruction in verse 11 is Shoah, S-H-O-A-H, which is also the word used by modern Jews for the Holocaust. In fact, Jewish people today observe an annual day of remembrance of the Holocaust victims, and it's called Yom HaShoah. Just as the Babylonians did not know destruction that was right around the corner, neither did the Jewish people during the 1930s. So now we move on to verse 12. Verse 12 is very strange. It says, "Stand fast in your enchantments and your many sorceries, with which you have labored from your youth. Perhaps you may be able to succeed. Perhaps you may inspire terror." What is Isaiah saying? You know, back in verse 9, we learned that Babylon would lose everything they had in just one day. And Isaiah added that all this will happen despite all your witchcraft and magic. But here, back in verse 11, Isaiah told the Babylonians that evil, disaster, and ruin will come upon you, which your magicians will not know how to handle. So now, in verse 12, Isaiah seems to be saying, if you don't believe me, go ahead and put your trust in all this foolishness. Who knows? Maybe it'll help you. Commentators think that Isaiah is actually using sarcasm, or that possibly he is taunting or mocking the Babylonians. I'm not so sure about that. I don't believe God would be pleased with Isaiah if he mocked the Babylonians. In both Isaiah chapter 42 and 49, God calls the Hebrew people to be a light unto the nations. God wanted the Jewish people to spread their knowledge of him, both verbally and through their behavior, to all the pagan nations, so that those nations would forsake their idols and turn to the one true God. Therefore, I believe that Isaiah is actually trying to obey God by being a light unto the Babylonians. I think that this is Isaiah's way of trying to get through their thick heads, past their stubbornness and pride, before it's too late for them. Isaiah knew that the Babylonians trusted their magicians and the spells that they cast because they grew up with it. He also knew that they trusted the vast knowledge that Babylon had accumulated in her extensive libraries which her vast numbers of experts could consult in order to interpret events. Thus, it would be very difficult to convince the Babylonians that judgment was about to fall upon them. Even so, God does not wish for anyone to perish. Isaiah warned them, but they were not ready to listen. What about today? Just as the Babylonians relied on their astrologers and magicians, many people today still do the same thing. I don't know if you're familiar with a publication or an organization called the Pew Research Center, but they're a Christian organization that does surveys. And back in 2024, just 2 years ago, they did a survey that found that 30% of U.S. adults say they consult astrology or a horoscope, tarot cards, or a fortune teller at least once a year. Also, just 1% of U.S. adults say they rely a lot on what they have learned from those practices when making major life decisions. An additional 5%, they rely a little on what they have learned for major life decisions. So I looked up the population statistic to see what 1% or 5% would translate into. And as of this month, there are, and this survey was only for adults, not children, there are 276.8 million adults in the United States. Therefore, 1% of these adults equals 2.77 million adults. So that means 2.77 million adults in the U.S. rely a lot on horoscopes, tarot cards, or fortune tellers to make major life decisions. And an additional 13.84 million adults use those things a little bit to make major life decisions. Are we any wiser today than the Babylonians were over 2,500 years ago? Some things never change. So we move on to verse 13. It says, "You are wearied with your many counsels. Let them stand forth and save you." Well, Isaiah knew that the Babylonian leaders had received numerous and conflicting opinions from their many advisors. Babylon prided itself on its knowledge and wisdom, which it gathered not only from the constellations of the sky, but also from inspecting, this may sound a little gross, the internal organs and intestines of sacrificed animals. Yeah, there was a title given to such a person called a Haruspex, Haruspex, was a person trained to practice divination by inspecting the entrails or internal organs of sacrificed animals, especially the livers of sacrificed sheep and poultry. And various ancient cultures in the Near East, such as the Babylonians, also read omens, specifically from the liver. They even analyzed the rising smoke from the sacrifice. The Bible actually contains several references of divination practices, including the examination of entrails. And I'm going to briefly read one verse from Ezekiel chapter 21 that says, and this is from the NLT, "The king of Babylon now stands at the fork, uncertain whether to attack Jerusalem or Rabbah. He calls his magicians to look for omens. They cast lots by shaking arrows from the quiver. They inspect the livers of animal sacrifices." So that's how the king decided whether or not who to attack. While these sorcerers interpreted the signs of the times through animal sacrifices, Babylon's astrologers looked to the skies, to the heavens. Verse 13 says, these astrologers are those who divide the heavens, who gaze at the stars, who at the new moons make known what shall come upon you. Babylon's astrologers divided the heavens into segments in order to study the movement of heavenly bodies across the sky, and from those movements predict earthly events. For example, one such prophecy says, when Jupiter becomes bright, the weapons of the king of Akkad, which was a city in Mesopotamia, will prevail over those of his foe. When Jupiter becomes bright, this king's going to be victorious. That actually reminds me of a popular song from back in 1969 by a group called The Fifth Dimension that you may remember. The lyrics of the song say, when the moon is in the seventh house and Jupiter aligns with Mars, then peace will guide the planets and love will steer the stars. This is the dawning of the age of Aquarius, age of Aquarius. Does anybody remember that song? It was a huge hit. Astrology was very popular in the 1960s. Like I said, some things never change. Thus, Babylon's spiritual advisors provided her with many theories on how to influence the gods, some based on animal sacrifices, others based on the stars and planets. However, it was all useless. So now the Babylonian leaders had to choose which of her so-called experts predicted the future correctly. And thus Isaiah says, you are wearied by your many counsels. So we now move to verse 14, which begins with another figure of speech. This time it's a simile. It says, behold, they are like stubble. The fire consumes them. They cannot deliver themselves from the power of the flame. The consequences of trusting in astrology and magical spells will result in these Babylonian officials and sorcerers being like dry stubble that fire can quickly consume. And this verse is actually strikingly similar to another verse in Isaiah back in chapter 5, and I'll read that. It says, therefore, as the tongue of fire devours the stubble, and as dry grass sinks down in the flame, so their root will be as rottenness, and their blossom go up like dust. For they have rejected the law of the Lord of hosts, and have despised the word of the Holy One of Israel. Interesting thing, in that passage, God brings judgment, but not against Babylon, but against Israel, who had abandoned Yahweh and his laws. This judgment against Israel took place about 150 years before Babylon invaded Judah. And it took the form of the Assyrian army invading the northern kingdom of Israel. However, Isaiah here uses the figure of speech of fire devouring stubble to symbolize God's judgment against Israel. And in the same way, here in chapter 47, stubble is defined as dry grass or straw. And verse 14 is saying that Babylon's astrologers are as powerless as stubble burned up in fire. When they are tested by fire, they will be devoured in an instant, just like dry grass. Verse 14 ends with the statement, no coal for warming oneself is this, no fire to sit before. This verse actually refers back to Isaiah 44, where wise men actually cut down trees for their wood. And Isaiah says in 44:15, he takes a part of it and warms himself. He kindles a fire and bakes bread. Also, he makes a god and worships it. He makes it an idol and falls down before it. The fire, built with wood from various trees, burned slowly and provided consistent heat to keep people warm. But in contrast, the coals from stubble in Isaiah 47 are useless because the stubble quickly burns and the coals quickly die out. Isaiah is saying that the fire of judgment will be no pleasant little campfire, warm and inviting. This is the fire of God's judgment, and it will be more like a raging brush fire, devouring everything in its path. Babylon will not survive. So we move to verse 15, which says, "Such to you are those with whom you have labored, who you have done business with from your youth. They wander about, each in his own direction. There is no one to save you." So what is he saying? Remember back in verse 13, Isaiah told us that Babylon wearied herself getting advice from all her advisors, sorcerers, astrologers. And in verse 14, he says those so-called wise men are as powerless as stubble or dry grass burned up in fire. Here in verse 15, he refers to these wise men as business associates who have made their living off her since her earliest times. Notice that the phrase, "with whom you have labored from your youth," it also was in verse 12, where it clearly referred to sorcerers casting spells. So I believe here in verse 15, it appears to be another metaphor, meaning that Babylon has labored and trafficked or done business with sorcerers and magicians for hundreds of years. And that's going to be her undoing. Verse 15 concludes this chapter by saying, "They wander about, each with his own direction. There's no one to save you." Each of the sorcerers and magicians wander about in different directions, looking for a solution to help Babylon. Their wandering around for an answer only demonstrates the lack of knowledge of the real truth. Ultimately, they abandon Babylon. Thus, there is nobody who can save her from God's judgment. God's message to Babylon about committing evil is very valid for us today and is addressed, I believe, to all countries that would commit all kinds of evil, especially mistreating the nation of Israel. So we'll close with the benediction that Aaron, the brother of Moses, gave. "The Lord bless you and keep you. Yivarechecha Adonai v'yishmerecha. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. Ya'eh Adonai panav elecha v'yichunecha. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. Yisa Adonai panav elecha v'yasem lecha shalom." You are dismissed.